Hi, everyone. Welcome to Modern Machine Learning, Simple Methods That Work. My name is Adit Rada. I'll be the instructor for this course. And this course will have three wonderful TAs, Max, George, and Kathy, who have all helped prepare course material. And naturally, this course would not even be possible without the support of my faculty advisor, Caroline Mueller. So thank you again very much for making this course happen. And I hope everyone has a good time. So I wanted to start off this course with a brief introduction and an overview of the types of material that we'll learn in this class. But maybe first, I wanted to begin with a review of some of the key successes of machine learning, and in particular, deep learning in this past decade. And I think these successes, I've tried to pick some that have kind of been crucial in making machine learning very, very popular this past decade. But one of the things that I wanted to highlight via this slide is that deep learning has the capability of transforming many, many different domains. And as an example, what I've listed here is beginning with AlexNet and ResNet. These are two convolutional neural networks which kind of transform the space of computer vision by producing models that surpass human performance on image classification tasks. Similarly, you have two different models up here where DeepMind and Google Brain have used deep neural networks to transform reinforcement learning applications by training neural networks to play games, in particular, a variety of Atari games. And of course, this popular one, which many of you probably know, training a neural network to play the game of Go at a professional level. And then I think in the past 2 years, there's been a number of popular results from deep learning. And in particular, two of them that come to mind are GPT-3 from OpenAI and then AlphaFold from Google. And GPT-3, of course, has kind of surprised us all with how good it is at generating some text. And similarly, AlphaFold kind of made a remarkable result in biology by being able to predict protein structure. And so one thing I wanted to emphasize, again, is that you have one sort of class of machine learning methods that has transformed many, many different domains. And I think this is one of the real powers of deep learning, which is that deep learning provides enough flexibility to enable a variety of successes. Okay. So now, after hearing all of this stuff in the news, we can take the perspective of a newcomer to the field who maybe is not a deep learning expert, but they want to use machine learning or deep learning to solve a specific task that they have in mind. So as a quick example, let's say I specifically am new to the field and I want to classify two different types of animals and images. And I want to classify between cats and birds. So very simple binary classification task. Maybe I've heard of all of the successes of deep learning, but I don't know too much. But what I've heard is that deep convolutional networks are very capable of doing this task at basically a superhuman level of performance. So I say, why don't I just start with this? I know this is going to work quite well. Okay, so here's how this kind of looks as a big pipeline. I'll have some input cat and bird images. Here we have some eagles and tigers. Then I want kind of as a black box, deep convolutional network. And I want to be able to train this thing to predict whether the objects in the images are cats or birds. Okay, so I give it my first best effort. But there's a number of problems that I run into. And I think the first problem that a lot of people would ask is what kind of architecture do I use? Do I use it, and it's specifically how many layers do I use? So do I have a 20-layer convolutional network? How many filters should I have per layer? There's a whole bunch of architectural questions that come to mind. And then, of course, there's always the question of what kind of layers do I use? I know I said this is a convolutional network, but I've heard of all these other things like batch normalization layers, dropout. People have told me that this really helps improve performance. Where do I put these? Can I tell if this is working correctly or not? And then lastly, after my first attempt, maybe I keep getting 60% accuracy. I know that a random chance, because there's only two classes, I should be able to predict whether the object is a cat or a bird with 50% chance at random. 60% doesn't seem to be so much better. Am I doing something wrong, or is this problem really just this hard? So I don't know how many of you have encountered these questions up front, but this is definitely some questions I had when I got started in machine learning. And I think this is one of the cons of deep learning, where it gives you a lot of flexibility, but it's kind of a double-edged sword, where if you're a beginner, deep learning provides too much flexibility. It's an overwhelming amount of flexibility, and maybe you just want something simple that works well. Okay, so now that we've at least asked these questions, you would think maybe there's, with enough information, we can kind of answer these questions and move forward from there. So let's just turn to the first question. How many layers do I use? And let's consider this in the context of image classification. I think the unfortunate answer is that there's no clear answer based on the results of the past several years. And starting in 2015, there's been a number of models of varying architectures that all work well on image classification. And ResNets, for example, claim that using super deep networks with residual connections work well. Wide ResNets, on the other hand, actually achieve the same performance by increasing the number of filters per layer, but shrinking the depth of the network. Then you have all of these other recent architectures, which claim to do a mixture of both and get very, very good results, state-of-the-art results on the ImageNet task. So already here, it's kind of tricky to decide what architecture I want to pick for any given problem. On the other hand, if you want to answer this question, what kind of layers do I use? First of all, you would think, okay, it's a convolutional network. I feel convolutions will be very, very good for images. Actually, even that fundamental choice of convolution, it's still unclear whether that is kind of the best thing to do, let alone use things like batch norm or dropout. I think there's still no clear answer, and two prominent examples that came to mind to me, at least recently, are these papers by OpenAI and Google, where you have full transformer models that kind of do amazing at image classification. And similarly, you have these all fully connected networks that do incredible at image classification as well. So I think there's some fundamentals that are still missing here. And of course, the most popular question, I think, is, am I doing something wrong? Like, if my model's getting 60%, what's going on? And here's where somebody who has some deep learning expertise, if they're trying to debug, there's a whole checklist of stuff that you have to check. So maybe you picked the wrong optimizer. Maybe the person picked an incorrect learning rate that's too large. Maybe you have to use a learning rate schedule. Maybe there's something wrong with the architecture. Maybe it's not wide enough or deep enough to get things to work. And of course, maybe you've just initialized the neural network incorrectly at the beginning, so it's not training properly. So there's a lot to check, and there's a lot of things to be aware of where something can go wrong in your training process. On the other hand, if you're confident everything is correct and you're getting 60%, maybe there's a simple baseline that you can establish to make sure that your model is doing better than you would think. And I think the issue with this task, especially for image data, is that if you want to establish a baseline via something like linear regression or logistic regression, I think those models tend to perform quite poorly on this high-dimensional data set because they're using pixel-pixel relationships, which might not be as meaningful here. So I think there has to be some sort of other method that we can come up with to get some of these simple baselines and kind of get some good sanity checks to see if things are working well. And that's a large part of what we'll do in this course. But just for now, focusing on these simple baselines that I mentioned, I think there is, for the newcomer at least, a nice simplicity to a lot of these classical methods. And in particular, two of the classical methods that I wanted to focus on are linear and kernel regression. These two are conceptually very, very simple. And basically what's happening is if you're given some data, you want to essentially extract some features from that data and find a line of best fit. And this line of best fit should give you a simple baseline. And in particular, if you're using something like kernel regression, where you extract some nonlinear features, it should give you a nice nonlinear fit to the data that could technically work well. I think the best part about linear and kernel regression, as we'll see in this course through several examples, is that it's super easy to implement in practice, and honestly, very little can go wrong when coding this thing. You're essentially solving a linear system of equations. And there's basically one command you can run to do this in any of the popular libraries you have. The downside to a lot of these methods, though, at least what seems like a downside, is that they lack this flexibility that neural networks give. And in particular, what I mean by this is that it's not that the model class is inflexible, it's rather that if I'm given an image classification task, how do I actually pick a good kernel to do a good job for some of these tasks? So if you're familiar with kernel methods, which we will cover in this course, this is quite a non-trivial problem. There's been many approaches that try to do something like this. But the issue is, I know I can apply neural networks to things like text. I can apply neural networks to signal processing data. How do I do the same thing with kernels in kind of a principled way? And so this is kind of the big question that I had as motivation for this course, which is, can we somehow merge the simplicity of these classical methods, these kernel methods, with the flexibility and effectiveness of deep learning? And I think the remarkable answer is that, yes, we can actually do this now. And that's kind of the main goal of the course. So our main goal is we're going to actually utilize some recent work that has connected kernel methods and neural networks. And we're going to build this simple, flexible, and competitive framework for machine learning algorithms that provide some very, very good results. And in fact, these results are quite competitive with what you would get with deep learning models. And just as a high-level overview, there's a couple of driving themes that are powering this sort of framework. And these are two very, very recent results in machine learning that we will cover extensively in the course. So the first one is this benefit of over-parameterization. And what do I mean by this? It means that larger and larger models tend to generalize better in practice. And this is one of the things that we've seen with the rise of deep networks in the past decade. I mean, GPT-3 has around 175 billion parameters. It's quite a large model. And in fact, one of the things they identified through that work is that even increasing model size will likely let GPT-3 perform even better. And there's some nice intuition around why this is happening, and I'll share some of that in a later slide today. The other driving factor for why we're able to produce this simple methods that work is that under a certain set of conditions, training super wide, so super large neural networks, is actually equivalent to solving kernel regression with a specific kernel called the neural tangent kernel. And this is kind of an astounding result because what we're doing is connecting a very sort of classical simple method of kernel regression with training this very complex object, which is a neural network. And we're claiming that the two are actually equivalent in some case. And so these two findings, based off one, by the way, if you're able to solve kernel regression instead of train a wide neural network, and we know that wide neural networks are supposed to do better, this is kind of like the dream. So we'll be able to produce a lot of models that work well in practice. And so I think there's two takeaways I wanted students to get out of the course. And the first one is that this neural tangent kernel approach is essentially a tool that you can use to quickly establish strong baseline machine learning models. And so if you have this if you're a newcomer and you have this problem of I want to do cat versus bird classification, there is a very simple principled approach to get a good baseline, and then from there you can start going to crazier models. You can start looking into deep networks, but at least you have something that works, and it works quite well. And I think the side takeaway out of all of this is that we're actually going to be doing a full theoretical development of these methods. And importantly, I think after taking this course, students should have an understanding of the fundamentals that have appeared that will help them read a lot of the recent literature in deep learning theory. So I hope that's a fun side takeaway for students involved in this class. Okay, so now that we've kind of understood the course goals and the main takeaways, I wanted to go into some of the specifics of what we'll learn in this class, and I wanted to start it off with the fundamentals of linear and kernel regression. And so just at a high level, we're going to get to all of this stuff in the upcoming lectures in great detail. But at a high level, linear regression is just the simple process of if you have a set of data points, here you have some data in one dimension. So you have one-dimensional features on the x-axis and one-dimensional labels on the y-axis. You want to fit a line that kind of best approximates the data. And we'll talk about what it means to exactly find a line of best fit and how do you quantify this. But this is the high-level idea. You just want to find a line that fits your data reasonably well. And so why is this even useful? I mean, if you're thinking about things like image classification, honestly, there probably isn't a line of best fit to that data that works reasonably well. You probably want to have some nonlinear function that fits the data. And so this is where the idea of kernel regression comes in, which is just a very simple extension of linear regression. And the idea is as follows. So let's say you're given a data set. Here I'm given a data set in 2 dimensions. So I have these 2 features, x1 and x2. And here the goal is I have this data lies on 2 concentric circles, and I want to classify between the orange and the blue points. So I want the model to be able to tell me, yes, this point is either an orange point, or no, it's not, it's a blue point. And so how can I do this? Well, clearly, I would want to fit a model that has a decision boundary that says if everything in the center circle is a blue point, everything outside is an orange point. But I can't do this via drawing any line of best fit. So there's no like line that I can draw here that will separate the orange and the blue points. But here's the clever trick. If I want to keep this idea of using a line of best fit to data, what I can do is just add an extra feature. So instead of working with this 2-dimensional data, I can make my features 3D. So instead of just considering features x1 and x2, I add an extra feature, which is just the radius of the circle, the point that the point sits on. And this is just the square of the radius, x1 squared plus x2 squared. So the idea is I've actually transformed my data to a higher dimensional space. And now the best part is that I can actually do this line of best fit. I can draw a plane in this space, where everything above the plane is orange points, everything below the plane is blue points. And so this is sort of the key idea for kernel regression. And it's basically to transform your data into a space where you can do a line of best fit and you can build effective models. And so these 2 methods, I think, are at the fundamental core of this course. And so we'll be expanding upon them. And the whole idea is how do you actually construct these feature maps that transform you to a higher dimensional space? That's kind of the key thing that we'll be analyzing in this course. Okay, so now this is great. This is all very classical fundamentals of machine learning. Now the question is, how does this relate to neural networks? Right now, we know that we have to pick some sort of feature map or kernel that lets us fit a line in a higher dimensional space, but we want to make sure that feature map is actually kind of useful. And right now, we don't really know how to select those feature maps, but neural networks actually give us kind of a nice way to do this. And so at a high level, the simplest thing that we can do to connect neural networks and kernel regression is to actually consider the simple case of a neural network where you only train the last layer. And what I mean by this is if you have a neural network with 2 weight matrices, A and B shown here, and it has 1 hidden layer, where you have the hidden units here. The idea is, let's just take B to be a random matrix. And if I'm using my neural network to fit some data, I actually don't want to update the parameters B at all. I only want to train the parameters given in matrix A. And so this might not be such a useful practical model, but it is a very simple way to connect kernel regression to neural networks. And the idea is that this whole first part of the neural network is a kind of feature map. So I'm taking my input X, I'm effectively multiplying it by a random matrix B, maybe applying some nonlinearity. And this now, this hidden units, these are going to be my embedding. This is going to be my transformed input X. And so what am I doing? I'm applying a linear regression model to transformed data. And this is exactly, if you try to solve linear regression in this way, the corresponding kernel that comes out of it is called the neural network Gaussian process. And we'll cover this in extensive detail because computing these things is kind of a key aspect to making our method useful. But what is the main takeaway here? Well, this is a very simple connection between training neural networks and solving kernel regression, kind of a trivial connection almost, where you just train only the last layer of the neural network. And so I think one thing that already stands out as interesting here is that you can do this for any neural network, and it's exactly equivalent to solving a form of kernel regression. The interesting part, though, is what happens if I take this number of hidden units and I make it super large. In fact, if I have k hidden units, I want to think about the case where this k goes to infinity. And I think the cool part about this whole thing is that kernel regression allows you to solve linear regression in these super high dimensional spaces. Even in infinite dimensional spaces, you can solve kernel regression. And so if you let this k go to infinity, you effectively have an infinite dimensional transformation of your input data X. And we can actually tractably write out and solve kernel regression in this space. And we will be doing this in this course. But maybe one question is, why would anyone want to do this? Is there actually some benefit for doing this? And this is kind of where we first introduced this whole idea of over-parameterization being beneficial. So on the previous slide, if we're considering this case where k goes to infinity, we have way, way, way more parameters than data points. I mean, we technically have infinitely many parameters in some way, and we only have finitely many data points. So we're always over-parameterized. We can always perfectly fit the training data. But the idea is there actually some benefit to this? Does this model actually generalize to test data better? And for anyone who had studied machine learning maybe more than 5 years ago, or actually more than 4 years ago, they would probably say no. And I think the classical reasoning was that when you have a model that can perfectly fit your training data, so its training loss is super low, it will overfit the test data. So your test loss will be very high. But actually what happens is if you consider this range of models where all of them are over-parameterized, so all of them achieve zero training loss, what you'll actually see is that the test loss starts coming back down. And in most cases, this test loss comes back down lower than you would have seen with some under-parameterized model, so some model that could not fit your training data. And I think this is one of the big surprising findings from deep learning that has given us a lot of insight into even classical and traditional machine learning methods and their behavior. So we will, of course, be covering this because this is a very confusing picture, maybe surprising picture. We will be covering it in an extensive amount of detail. But at least this picture, having it in mind, motivates why we would want to consider these super large models where this widths go to infinity. In fact, here what we've done, when I say considering larger and larger models, we're increasing the width of the neural network. We're increasing that value k for the number of hidden units. And so we can even ask, like, how does an infinitely wide model do? And hopefully we would see that that model does quite well. It has kind of the lowest or close to low training loss. And that's actually what we'll see in this course. So those infinitely wide neural networks do have very low training loss. And for those of you who are interested in learning about this a bit more upfront, this phenomenon is referred to as double descent. And there's been a nice paper by Misha Belkrin and Daniel Su, Xiwan Ma, and Sumit Mandal on this. So I highly encourage everyone to go and check out this paper, but of course we'll be covering this in class as well. Okay. So thus far, we've kind of established a very simple connection between neural networks and kernel regression. And I think this will take us through the first week of the course. The unfortunate thing, though, is that that connection we established was kind of trivial. I don't think, at least everyone I know in practice, does not use neural networks where they freeze all of the layers except for the last one. People typically train all layers of a neural network. So is there really a connection between kernels and neural networks in this sense? And actually, this is kind of one of the most remarkable findings of the decade, I think, is that yes, as neural networks, as these neural network widths grow super large, training this sort of infinitely wide neural network under certain conditions is exactly equivalent to solving kernel regression with a specific type of kernel. And I think, many of you might not at this point be familiar with what kernels are. We're going to cover that in the next 2 days. But just as a fundamental picture, what this is saying is you're training a super complex nonlinear model. In fact, optimization for this thing is even you're optimizing over some non-convex landscape. So it's a very difficult thing to understand. On the other hand, if you take this model and you make it super, super wide, you make it huge, you're effectively solving linear regression in some transform space. And linear regression, I think, is one of the first machine learning models that you would ever learn if you took a machine learning course. So this is truly a remarkable finding, and the fact that you can tractably compute what these neural tangent kernels are and use them in practice is a really amazing result. So just to recap, not only are you able to do this, not only are you able to solve linear regression in a transform space and match what a neural network would do, the best part about this whole thing is that based on this benefit of over-parameterization, we would actually expect this linear model to do really, really well. And the question is, how well does it actually do in practice? Is it beating out neural networks, and why should we ever go back to neural networks and do anything? So the answer is this is still up for contention, but there's been a lot of recent work showing that the neural tangent kernel and the corresponding neural tangent kernel for any architecture, including convolutional ones, works really, really well. And so the first example that kind of came out that I saw was just the neural tangent kernel for fully connected networks gives state-of-the-art results on several different tasks. This is like hundreds of tasks from this UCI database. And these are all simple regression or classification tasks that have been dominated by random forests or gradient boosted trees over the past years, but NTK actually gives quite good results. Maybe the more interesting thing, because we talked about the flexibility of neural networks on a lot of domains, the NTK actually gives us flexibility for kernel methods and kind of a principled way of building kernels for a bunch of different tasks. And one example is actually image classification. So what we could do is we can compare a number of types of neural networks, which is exactly what this group from Google Brain did. They did a very thorough comparison between training a neural network to classify images and solving kernel regression with the convolutional neural tangent kernel, the CNTK. And they just wanted to see how well these models do. So first of all, they considered these neural networks, which were just all convolutional nets. And there was 2 types of last layers that they used. One of them was the standard fully connected last layer. Another one was called global average pooling, which we will also cover in this course. But the key takeaway of this table is that if you actually look at the performance of the CNTK, it's actually quite a bit better than training a neural network when you have this fully connected last layer. It's 6% is quite a big difference. On the other hand, when you have pooling, there's actually a very small difference, and this is really reflected in the loss here, where you have to go to the 3rd decimal place to really see a change in the loss. So I think this is a very strong case for kernel methods becoming very powerful, especially because they have this conceptual simplicity to them. But of course, many people are still interested in closing this gap, and I think this is a good open question. But for now, I think it's enough to say that this establishes a very strong baseline for many tasks. And for those of you who are curious, just like you can modify neural networks with a bunch of tricks, you can use batch norm, dropout, whatever. Applying some of those same tricks to the neural tangent kernel actually lets us achieve 89% test accuracy on CFAR10. And this is kind of remarkable. This is actually matching what AlexNet did in 2012 on this task. So this is still a growing field. I mean, this result just came out a couple of years ago, but already we're kind of matching some of the impressive results. I think the thing is to see how far we can take this. And this is all so far on classification. One application that we're actually going to get into the details of in this course is actually using the NTK for things like image inpainting and reconstruction. And so I wanted to just briefly discuss to motivate, some of the cool things that you can do with this. There's this nice task called image inpainting, where if you have, let's say, an image that's been corrupted in some way. So in this case, maybe on this image on the left here, you have this flower pot removed, and you want to somehow train a machine learning model to fill in that region with what you think is reasonable. So maybe it doesn't know how to fill in the flower pot, but it puts something, at least completes the table, and completes the rest of the image in a reasonable way. So this is image inpainting, in particular, large hole inpainting. And then there's a secondary task, which is very similar, which is reconstruction. So again, some sort of corrupted image, and you want to fill it in and reconstruct the original one in a nice way. One of the remarkable results, another remarkable neural network result in the past few years, is that untrained, so these are neural networks that are just randomly initialized, and you train them just on this one corrupted image. You feed in random noise into the neural network, and you ask it to reconstruct only the observed pixels in this image. So you basically tell the neural network it can put whatever it wants in this missing region. And the cool part is that neural networks already do a kind of amazing job at this task. And so you can see here that the neural network actually reconstructed the table reasonably well. It put in some kind of blur, but at least in the center region, but it kind of matches the textures and colors of the rest of the image. And so this kind of magical fact might seem mysterious at first, but the cool part is that if you believe that neural networks can be well approximated by this linear model given by the neural tangent kernel, we should be able to do the same thing with kernels. And in fact, that's exactly what we do. What we'll show in this course is how you can take images like this, and which are corrupted in some way, and just via a kernel method applied to this image alone. You're not using any labeled data. You don't have like millions of images to work with. You have just this individual one. You're able to get quite good reconstructions. And in fact, the reconstructions in the middle are given by corresponding neural networks, which have a bunch of tricks. They have batch norm, they have some nonlinear last layer, they have some clever tricks that they use there. But the best part is that on average, if you have some quantitative metric to see which images look better, the neural tangent kernel actually gives you on average the best results for this task, which is definitely quite surprising, because again, it is just a linear model applied to fit the pixels in this image, and it can put whatever it wants in this missing region. So I think the upshot of all of this is that what we've done traditionally with neural networks, which are kind of complicated and difficult to understand, through this course, you'll actually learn to do some of the same amazing things with a very simple class of models, namely kernels and kernel regression. And this can actually be done quite efficiently. And I think that's a very exciting prospect, and should hopefully open up a lot of research avenues for many of you, so that you're not just focused on grinding through and figuring out the best architecture for a given task, but rather spending some time more on the higher level research questions of interest, especially if you work in a different application domain like biology or chemistry. Okay, so with that, I know that was a kind of a lightning fast review of a lot of the course material, but I just wanted to give a flavor of the different topics that we'll see over the 2 weeks. And now I wanted to talk a little bit about logistics, and also maybe what things you should hope to be familiar with by the end of the course. So apart from the lecture notes and videos that I'll be posting online, there are going to be 4 problem sets. Basically doing at least half the questions correctly on the problem set should give you a passing grade. I know this class is just pass or fail. The problem sets are kind of unique in that they'll have a mix of theory and coding questions. And I will occasionally require, I think the first introductory problem set, which tests preliminaries, I have required 5 questions on. But for the rest of the problem sets, it should be very few problems are required. And you can kind of pick whatever else to work on. So I'll give you a ton of problems, and you can pick a subset of 2 or 3 of them, and solve them and submit them. And so this is just to reinforce, maybe if you're more interested in coding and you want to see the practical applicability of these methods, you can focus more on that instead of the theory. Maybe if you're interested in the theory and you want to use this for your research, the theoretical question should help in doing that. So lastly, I think for all students, there's going to be a couple of libraries that I wanted the students to get familiar with, and these are 1, fast kernel regression solvers given by EigenPro, and 2, some modern libraries for computing the NTK. So this we'll see in the second week. So this is by Google. This is the Neural Tangents library, which basically lets you, whatever neural network architecture you can think of, you code that up and it'll give you this kernel corresponding to that architecture. It's a pretty amazing library. So I hope students will find that interesting. There will also, on top of the 4 problem sets, there's going to be a project proposal and a paper review. And I hope students choose to do the project proposal. I think it'll be quite interesting. But basically, for either of these, you can work in groups of at most 3 people. I think you can work in, you can work by yourself. You can work with at least 2 other people, or at most 3. And for the proposal, what I would want students to do is, if they have a research problem of interest that they feel the NTK could help solve, or if they have some new theoretical findings they want to follow up on related to the material from the course, they would prepare a 5-minute slide deck, kind of highlighting the problem, highlighting recent work related to the problem, and then what they propose as a solution, what would be interesting to them. On the other hand, if you are not interested in doing a project proposal, there's always a paper review option. And I have to say, a large part of this course is making this quite technical material available for a broader audience. So what I would want to see from students is that they take some of these technical papers and prepare a 5-minute slide deck for a super broad audience, reviewing the paper's key findings and their key results and how it relates to the course. And so I hope this will be a fun class for everyone. And I'm looking forward to seeing you all, hopefully in person, in the next week. Apart from this, though, the second half of the first lecture is just going to be a review of some topics in linear algebra, probability, and analysis that will probably be helpful for the course, and especially helpful for the first problem set. So I'll see you all in the next lecture. Thanks.